In the year 1913, one of the wealthiest men who ever lived signed a series of quiet checks that would change the inside of every public library in the United States. His name was Andrew Carnegie. By the time he was finished, he had funded the construction of more than 1,600 public libraries across America and several thousand more around the world. The official story is that he was a philanthropist. The official story is that he loved knowledge, loved reading, and wanted every small town in the country to have a place where ordinary people could borrow a book for free. That is the story you were taught in school. That is the story written on the bronze plaques outside the buildings. But if you look at what actually happened inside those buildings in the years after they opened, a much stranger pattern starts to surface. Because Carnegie did not just build the libraries, he also paid for what went on the shelves. He paid for the cataloguing systems, the librarian training, and the new printed editions of the books themselves. And in that same window of years, between roughly 1908 and 1920, a quiet, countrywide purge of older books began. Books printed before the Civil War, books printed before 1800, volumes that had sat in town libraries, church libraries, and private collections for generations. They were declared outdated, declared damaged, declared unfit, and they were removed. Some were burned, some were pulped, some were sent to warehouses and never seen again. And in their place, on the new oak shelves of the new Carnegie buildings, fresh editions appeared, newly printed, newly edited, newly approved. This is the story of what was on those old shelves before the new books arrived, and why a single man in a single decade may have rewritten the memory of an entire country. Before we go any deeper, take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We tell long, careful documentary stories on subjects the standard history books either skip or smooth over. If you find this kind of story interesting, that small tap genuinely helps us keep digging. To understand what happened in 1913, you have to understand who Andrew Carnegie actually was. He came to America from Scotland as a poor boy, worked in a textile mill, then a telegraph office, then the railroads. By the 1870s, he had moved into steel, and by the 1890s, he controlled the largest steel operation in the world. When he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901, the sale created United States Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. Carnegie personally walked away with the modern equivalent of more than $10 billion in cash. He was, for a brief period, the richest private individual on the planet. And then, very publicly, he announced that he was going to give it all away. He wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he argued that a rich man who died rich had died disgraced. The centerpiece of that redistribution was libraries, thousands of them, free public brick and stone with his name carved over the door. On the surface, this sounds like one of the kindest acts in American history. But look at the timing. Between 1890 and 1915, the United States went through one of the strangest construction booms in its history. Cities that had been small frontier towns just 30 years earlier suddenly grew enormous central buildings, courthouses with vaulted marble ceilings, state capitals with cast iron domes, train stations with arched glass roofs spanning entire city blocks. World's fairs were built and then almost entirely demolished within a single summer. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, called the White City, contained around 200 buildings in a neoclassical style, full of statuary, fountains, columns, and electric lighting. The official story is that it was constructed in about 2 years out of a temporary material called staff, a mix of plaster and jute fibre, and then torn down. An entire white marble-looking city, gone in months. And in the years immediately after these fairs, the libraries arrived, Carnegie libraries. Quiet, dignified neoclassical buildings in the exact same architectural language as the fair pavilions and the courthouses. They appeared in town after town, often replacing older wooden buildings that had served as the previous library or reading room. The old buildings were demolished, the old contents were removed, and the new building, with the new contents, took their place. Now here is where the official record starts to develop strange gaps. If you go looking for the catalogues of pre-Carnegie town libraries in the United States, you will find that for a surprising number of towns, those catalogues simply do not exist anymore. The handwritten ledger books, the index cards, the donation records, the lists of which families gave which volumes are missing. In the towns where they do survive, they list books that do not appear in the new Carnegie libraries that replace them. Books on subjects that quietly stopped being taught. Books on geography that described continents and coastlines slightly differently than the modern maps. Books on architecture that explained how to build domes, arches and stone vaults using techniques the modern construction industry claims required steel reinforcement to achieve. Books on what was called natural philosophy, the old word for science, that described phenomena involving atmospheric electricity, resonance and ether in ways that were quietly dropped from the curriculum within a single generation. And books, repeatedly, on the history of a place that almost no modern textbook will name. A vast continental empire mentioned in older atlases and older encyclopedias that stretched across the northern half of the world, Tartaria. By the time the Carnegie libraries had finished their work, that name was almost completely gone from the shelves. You can verify part of this yourself. If you pull up a digitized copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica from the late 1700s, or the early 1800s, the entry for Tartary, sometimes spelled Tartaria, is long and detailed. It describes a region stretching from the Volga River across all of Siberia, down through Central Asia, into parts of what is now northern China. Older maps, published in Amsterdam, London and Paris, show this region marked clearly, sometimes labelled Grand Tartary, sometimes Independent Tartary, sometimes Chinese Tartary. By the late 1800s, the entry begins to shrink. By the early 1900s, it is almost gone. By the time the new Carnegie editions of standard reference books are sitting on the new Carnegie shelves, Tartary has been replaced by a patchwork of Russian provinces, Mongolian regions and Chinese frontiers with no shared identity and no shared history. An entire civilization, the size of a continent, edited out of the reference section in about 3 decades. And the institutions that finished the edit were, in many small American towns, the Carnegie libraries. There is another detail worth sitting with. Carnegie did not simply hand over money and let towns build whatever they wanted. The grants came with conditions. A town that accepted a Carnegie Library grant had to agree to provide the land, fund the ongoing operation through local taxation, and follow the architectural and operational guidelines that Carnegie's office issued. Those guidelines specified the layout of the rooms, they specified the staffing, they specified the use of the new Dewey Decimal Classification System, which had been published in 1876 and was rapidly becoming standard. And the classification system itself quietly determined which subjects existed and which did not. A subject that had no Dewey number did not get a shelf. A book that did not fit a Dewey number became difficult to catalogue, and a book that was difficult to catalogue was easy to declare surplus. The system, by its very structure, defined the shape of acceptable knowledge. It is also worth looking at what the Carnegie libraries themselves looked like. If you walk into one of the surviving original buildings today, the masonry is heavier than anything modern. The ceilings are higher, the cornices are deeper, the stonework around the windows is carved with detail that no modern budget would allow. Many of them have copper roofs, leaded glass, marble staircases, and ornamental ironwork that would cost a fortune to reproduce now. Researchers who look closely at the budgets of these projects often find that the official construction costs, adjusted for inflation, are far too low for what was actually built. A small town Carnegie Library that cost, on paper, $12,000 in 1908 would, by any honest modern estimate, cost 10 to 50 times that to recreate from scratch today. And yet, town after town, they went up in months. The standard explanation is cheap immigrant labour and abundant raw materials. The standard explanation does not quite cover the carved limestone friezes. Some researchers, working outside the academic mainstream, have proposed something else. They suggest that many of the Carnegie libraries were not, in fact, built in the years they are officially dated. They suggest that the buildings were already there, that they were older structures, part of the same architectural civilization that produced the world's fairs, the courthouses, and the central train stations. That Carnegie's money did not pay for their construction, it paid for their reassignment. The buildings were renamed, new cornerstones were laid, new dedication plaques were carved, and the public was told that a wealthy steel magnate had given them this beautiful new building, when in fact the building had already stood on that ground for longer than anyone alive could remember. There is no signed document confessing to it. There is only the pattern of cost, the pattern of style, the pattern of timing, and the pattern of what disappeared from the shelves at exactly the moment the doors opened, because that is the part that is hardest to look away from. The books, wherever the buildings actually came from, the contents of those buildings were rewritten in a single generation. School board minutes from small towns in Ohio, Iowa, and upstate New York, from the years between 1908 and 1922, occasionally surface in local archives. They describe routine library committee meetings in which members vote to discard older volumes as obsolete. They list bonfires of damaged books in the backlots behind the libraries. They list shipments of older volumes to paper mills for pulping, often by the wagon load. One surviving committee record from a small town in Pennsylvania from 1914 mentions, almost in passing, the disposal of more than 4,000 volumes from the previous town reading room in order to make room for the new collection donated through the Carnegie program. 4,000 volumes from one small town, multiplied across more than 1,600 towns. The total, if even roughly accurate, is in the millions. And the approved manuscripts mattered, because in those same years the discipline of academic history in the United States was being rebuilt from the ground up. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, established by Andrew Carnegie in 1905, was one of the largest sources of funding for that standardization. It paid for textbook commissions, it paid for teacher training, it paid for the printing of new editions of basic school readers, basic histories, basic geographies. And those new editions were the ones that ended up on the new Carnegie Library shelves. The man who provided the buildings also provided the books, also provided the system for arranging the books, also provided the training for the people who handed the books to the public. At every layer of the chain the same name appears: Carnegie, Carnegie, Carnegie. None of this proves a deliberate erasure on its own. A wealthy man funding many connected projects is not, by itself, a conspiracy. But step back from the individual pieces and look at the shape of the result. Within roughly 20 years, between about 1900 and 1920, the American public lost casual access to the pre-1850 book. The old volumes that had sat in small private collections in church basements, in family parlours, and in volunteer reading rooms were swept into a single national clearance. The buildings that replaced those reading rooms were larger, grander, and more impressive than any small town could have built on its own. The books that filled those buildings were newly printed, newly approved, and newly consistent with each other. And the story those books told about America, about the world, about the continents and their histories, was the story we still read today. Anything that did not fit that story had, by the 1920s, become almost impossible for an ordinary citizen to find without travelling to a major research university. So when you stand in front of an old Carnegie Library today, in some quiet town with a creek running behind it and a flag out front, look at the building for a moment longer than you normally would. Look at the heaviness of the stone. Look at the carving above the door. Ask yourself how a single steel magnate, in a single career, paid for so many of these in so many places, in so few years. And then, when you walk inside, look at the shelves, look at the publication dates on the spines. Notice how few of them go back before about 1890. Notice how clean and continuous the record looks. Notice the absence of the older voices, the older maps, the older names. Notice that the building feels older than the books it contains. That gap between the age of the walls and the age of the pages is the gap this story lives inside. And whatever you choose to believe about who built the walls, the pages, at least, were changed in a deliberate and traceable way. by a small group of people in a small number of years with a very large amount of money. That part is not a theory. That part is in the public record. The rest is for you to sit with quietly the next time you pass under one of those carved stone arches and feel, just for a moment, that you are walking into a building that knows something it is not telling you.